Hello, everybody. Today is Wednesday, the 15th of November, and I wanted to just reach out to you and give you kind of a little bit of a discussion on our next study unit 11, or I guess discussion thread, I should say, where we look at organizational ethics, if you will, um, in connection with our professional ethics, as undergirded by our personal ethical frameworks and core values, right? Those always underpin everything we do, right, from day to day. So even though we may have a code of conduct at work, um, although we may have our own code of conduct as professionals like CPAs, CMAs, CIAs, underpinning that is our own ethical framework, okay? Um, so we kind of see where the readings take us. One of the interesting things that you'll find in the readings Duska brings out is that, unlike other professions, our code of conduct for CPAs, the American Institute of Certified Public Accountants, um, the paramount, the highest goal is to ensure the integrity of the practitioner in light of how the public views us, right? The public interest, keeping that sacrosanct, keeping that whole. Um, they go on to say in the text, unlike other professions like law and medicine, where the sacrosanct responsibility is privity or solely related to the practitioner and the patient, or the lawyer, the advocate, and the accountant, and the client, but not the public. Well, I kind of take issue with that, not because they're wrong, but in light of recent things we've seen with the COVID mandates, where physicians were now no longer, in most cases, caring for just the patient, but they were responding to political science and political pressures to endorse experimental vaccines, okay? Regardless of what you may think, there's a lot of controversy and more is coming out. And we're kind of seeing that doctor-patient relationship was kind of broken. Um, so I often wonder, how are we as CPAs or as accountants, have we broken trust with our constituents, right? With the public. Whereas I could criticize physicians and other healthcare providers for breaking trust that they're supposed to have with their individual patients, have we, as accountants, done something similarly? Um, so when you do the readings, focus on how the AICPA defines the public. Okay? Just look at the readings. And let me ask you, do you think that the public should be viewed in a broader sense? I'm kind of leading the witness here, right? Um, because in governmental accounting, or in our, shall I say, governmental financial management, whether it's federal, state, or local, when we look at the public, we see the citizenry, right? We see the taxpayers. We see those who are dependent upon government services as the public, not necessarily just taxpayers, right? Um, and maybe not necessarily just citizens either. So we take a pretty broad view of the public, I believe, in a governmental management or administrative approach or view. But you take a look at this and look at the AICPA code, see how they define public, and see if you agree with the principles. Okay. There are 6 principles that we can briefly go over. There's a responsibility principle that basically says, you need to exercise sensitive, moral, and professional judgments in all the things that you do. Okay, sounds very good. They don't tell you really, right? The code doesn't say what sensitive is. Duska brings that out. And, when you say all activities, Duska also notes CPAs don't practice or perform all activities. So how do we ring fence that at all? I guess that's a criticism of the code. But take a look at that. That's your responsibilities principle, but in general, no one would disagree. Then there's the public interest principle that we kind of just got done talking about, that you're supposed to serve the public interest. Well, who is the public, right? Is it limited just to the clients or just to those who rely on financial reporting information? Take a look at that, because it's, for those of us who are AICPA members and in government, I think we view the public definition differently than the code in a more broader sense. The integrity principle, right, you see here, you should perform all your responsibilities with the highest sense of integrity. How do you define integrity? Consistent application of principles regardless of client or user base, maybe, is one way. Kind of the deontological approach, following the rules, no matter to whom they may apply. Then there's the objectivity and independence principle. In internal auditing, we separate the two, because internal auditors, such as inspectors general and just chief audit executives and their staffs, cannot be independent, okay, by virtue of the fact that they're receiving a paycheck from the employer, but they can be objective, in their assessment of data gathering, evidence gathering, and evidence analysis and formulation of opinions. They can be objective even though they're not independent. Here, for us external auditors, if you will, we look at the two kind of hand in glove, okay, objectivity and independence. You've got to be free of conflict of interest, not only in fact, but in appearance. And this has been for us for years. When I say us, as accountants, other professions might just say you need to be independent in fact, so you can have lunch with clients or others. You might even be able to have close societal or social relationships with others. As CPAs, we have to be concerned with the appearance of how we conduct ourselves, both professionally and personally, and how that may impact the public's view of what we do and whether they can trust us, because that's the fundamental element, is trust, right? So we talk about that principle. Then we move to the due care principle. Of course, you have to exercise professional due care. You need to be competent in the field you're practicing, the audit area you're auditing. You need to have sufficient training, some experience in it. Hopefully you're part of a firm or an organization that's got a quality assurance program, like peer review program, to look over your work, those types of things. And the last principle is kind of like the ribbon on the box, the scope and nature of services principles, that if you're doing anything other than a test, or even the attest functions, but if you're doing any other client service, make sure you follow all the other principles, right? And step back and say, hey, if I do audits, can I also do the bookkeeping? Can I also do the consulting? Can I also do the tax work and still maintain the independence and objectivity I need and be free from conflict of interest, still exercise due professional care, still have integrity, all these things. One of the most radical things that happened about 20 years ago in the auditing profession was we moved away from a list of do's and don'ts, of sanctions, of things that you get sanctioned for, and we moved from a framework, from that kind of a framework to a framework that basically says the practitioner needs to self-identify threats to these, let's say, principles or to the rules of the road that are in the code of conduct. And if we see a threat, we have to look to see if we can develop, or if there exist, compensating controls, right, that would mitigate that threat to independence, for example, or objectivity. For example, having a quality assurance program might very well mitigate the fact that you may not be as independent or as objective as you'd like to be, or that you would be perceived as being, but because of the QA program, that kind of mitigates this risk, if you will, and potential code violation. You know, I kind of like it, but at the same time, I can see wide area of abuses in this type of, self-assessment, if you will. So look at these principles, and you'll be seeing the video on Alan Dershowitz, and I don't know if he said it here, but in this video, but I've seen him give interviews at the time where he basically said, look, I'm defending a very unpopular person, right? Because I believe his rights are being infringed or violated. You currently see, this is the former President Trump, that even the ACLU has come to his defense, saying that I think a gag order that was placed on him is a violation of free speech. So we're watching all this play out in society, and some of us, because of our biases and prejudices, want to see, for example, this president silenced, censored, canceled. Others, true libertarians or liberals, would say, no, like Mr. Dershowitz, that's not right. The ACLU, no, that's not right. And typically they view, of course, from a political point of view, totally opposite. But when you see the ACLU take this position, someone like Mr. Dershowitz, they're standing on principles, right? Like our AICPA 6 principles we just briefly touched on. At least that's what they're saying, right? And I believe it to be true. Now, let's hope that we as practitioners would do the same. And that's why in discussion thread, I'd like to read, and I did. I read one of the early posts. Our second poster did a very nice job explaining how she felt about a situation where a teammate of hers, who may not have been very nice to her, maybe they didn't like one another, which happens in life, but she intervened for that teammate. And it's kind of an example of saying, hey, look, I might not like this person, they might not look like me, but what's happening to them is wrong, and we got to stop it, okay? Our first poster also gave us a really good psychological view, because I've shared this too. Hers was about bearded men. Well, mine was about blonde people. My mother was a World War II nurse in Italy, and she helped aid the wounded, both German Nazis and Americans. And to her it didn't matter, they were looking to save lives and help soldiers who were suffering. But she told me about the brutality of the Nazis towards the Italian Jews, who they were looking, and they did save and help. They risked their lives for these Italian Jews because, as my mother would said, they're children of God, And what happened there was, she explained to me this issue of putting whatever feelings you may have aside, to care for people who, are hurt. But she in relaying that story to me, she mentioned that the Germans at the time were blonde and blue-eyed, and she had actually fallen in love with a German Nazi, and he died, and then ultimately she never married until she met my dad. Nice love story, but I digress. But because she told me that the Germans were blonde and blue-eyed as a little child, I had a bias against blonde and blue-eyed friends, and I didn't realize this bias until I was in my late 30s, and one day it hit me. A very touching story how it hit me. But when I realized it, I'm like, wow, my mother's experience from World War II created in me a bias towards blonde and blue-eyed people, to the point I didn't have any blonde and blue-eyed friends, not until later in life. It's just amazing. And I never thought I was prejudiced or biased, right? But in a way, I harbored this distrust, this fear almost of don't get close to a blonde or blue-eyed person, right? Kind of ridiculous, isn't it? But yet, as a child, you see. So I commend the first poster for bringing up the issue with bearded men, and how, again, psychologically these affect us, and we are exploring these things. So, what does this all kind of mean and lead up to? Well, I think what we're trying to get with this is that as public servants, right, we've got to serve the public as best as we can, putting aside the biases that we all have. And your discussion threads, I must say, over the last 2 or 3 weeks have gotten so much better. You're challenging one another, you're talking with one another. So thank you for that. The class really, shows a lot of thought in what you're doing. So please take a look at the readings. Introspectively, look at your core values. What drives you? Look at the 6 AICPA principles. Consider the code of conduct on your job. And think about how you would relate if there's a situation that, again, would require you to exercise courage. And maybe putting aside the bias you have towards someone because they're being mistreated or not being, managed the right way. And that's the challenge that, this course is designed to help you overcome those biases. Okay? So I think that's pretty much what I wanted to bring to your attention. There may have been another point or two which escapes me, but let's leave it there for now and focus on, again, you're going to be looking at paper 3. So with paper 3, we're going to move into looking at our deliverables and what we do. And these 6 principles may come into play. How can you improve the ethics in what you do? Okay, what courage, what integrity or competence can you exercise to make what you do better? And I need specifics, okay? Please, some of the papers, you're not, I'm being as generous as I can, but honestly, some of your papers are, a little light and weak, and you're not being self-reflective enough, and you're not really thinking about personal improvement, taking concrete steps in overcoming biases, and and even weaknesses, technical weaknesses. That's what I'm looking for, and I want to see some of these discussed in paper 3. Okay, so if you have any questions, again, reach out to me, let me know. But remember, ethics is extremely important, because whatever you got away with in the past has only emboldened you and weakened you morally for the next time you're tempted. And when you fall, you're going to fall, and it's going to be hurtful. It's really going to hurt you. Ethics can either take you to really high places in life and on your job, or it could take you down, all based upon the decisions you make. This class is to try to help you identify those weak areas, those areas you're afraid to admit, but you know exist. So you can deal with those demons, I call them demons, cage them up, and don't allow them to hurt you anymore. Don't allow them to stop you from being the better accountant that you can be, or the better public administrator that you can be. The country needs you. The world needs you. We need light in the world. Be that light, okay? Don't be afraid. If you are, it's only going to continue to haunt you, okay? So, stay well.